So this week we're going to be focusing on photosynthesis. So this is chapter 7 in your book. So as you're soon going to see, photosynthesis is actually very similar to cellular respiration. So a lot of the themes like the electron transport chain and cyclical reactions, we're going to see those come back up in photosynthesis. So to get us sort of primed for the content for today, here's a question for you to answer on Blackboard. So what is the overall reaction of photosynthesis? So the correct answer here is C. So plants take in carbon dioxide plus water and they make sugar from that. Also as a byproduct, they also make oxygen, which is one of the reasons why plants are considered very environmentally friendly. Since they take in a greenhouse gas, which causes global warming, so something like carbon dioxide, and they turn that into oxygen for us to breathe. So the correct answer here again is C. So the interesting thing, you may have noticed this, is that photosynthesis is actually almost the exact opposite of cellular respiration, at least looking at their overall reactions. So as a reminder, cellular respiration is about going from glucose plus oxygen, and that's turned into carbon dioxide, water, and most importantly, ATP. Of course, because of all these energy transformations, we also produce heat in this process. So photosynthesis, again, is the exact opposite of that. So you have carbon dioxide plus water being turned into sugar and oxygen. So you can imagine if we almost flip the arrow this way, essentially we would have photosynthesis. So remember, cellular respiration is actually an exergonic reaction. So that means it produces energy. And of course, that energy is then used to make ATP. So since we flipped the arrow here for photosynthesis you can think of being an endergonic reaction. So it's a reaction that requires energy, and that energy comes, of course, in the form of light. So as you know, all plants that do photosynthesis require light energy to actually make sugars. So with all this discussion of cellular respiration versus photosynthesis, as you can imagine, photosynthesis is also a redox reaction just like cellular respiration. In this instance, we're going from low energy to high energy. So as opposed to cellular respiration, which goes from high energy to low energy, here we're going from carbon dioxide and water, which are low energy, to something like glucose, which is a very high energy molecule. In this instance of photosynthesis, we have carbon dioxide reduced to glucose, and then water oxidized to oxygen. So essentially the reverse of cellular respiration, so the redox reaction is also reversed as well as the reaction itself. So I want to make an important point with this slide, and that's the fact that plants are critical for all of life. So as you know from chapter 1, the sun is really the source of all energy on Earth. And really the only organisms that can utilize the energy are plants. So when we talk more about ecosystems and ecology, we'll talk more about what I mean by producers as shown in this figure right here. But you can imagine that plants produce energy for everything else. So they're the only organisms that can take in energy and give that to other organisms. So something like this moose right here is able to take that sunlight energy, so essentially energy that ultimately came from the sun, and convert that into other molecules which can be used by different organisms. So again, all energy on Earth essentially comes from the sun, and plants are really the only organisms that can utilize that sun energy. And so plants are one of these four things, and this is a very particular word that I want you to be aware of. So try your best to answer this question. We'll come back in a few seconds and answer it. So let's go over the correct answer now. So plants are actually considered photoautotrophs. So it's a very big word, so let's start breaking it down. So the prefix photo, you can think of as something like a photograph. Photo is related to light. Auto, you can think of like an autobiography. So auto means self. And then troph, that's probably less familiar to you. So troph means nutrient matter. So essentially, a plant is using light, it's doing something for itself, and that's related to food. So essentially, this is a fancy way of saying that plants make their own food, and they make it through the process of photosynthesis. And of course, that light energy, as you all know, is energy from the sun. So that photo part, light comes from the sun, and that's how plants get energy to do photosynthesis. So let's do some plant anatomy really quick. So here we're actually looking at a cross-section of a leaf. So a leaf actually has an apical and a basal side. So apical is actually a technical term for the top side of the leaf, and basal means the bottom of the leaf. So leaves have both an apical and basal side, and they're slightly different. On the outermost edge of the leaf, we have a bunch of cellulose and some dead cells on the outside, which are providing defense and also keeping water and other things from evaporating outside of the plant. In the inner part of the leaf, we have what's called the mesophyll. So here we have a bunch of living cells, and these are the cells that actually do photosynthesis. So here is actually a nice little picture that shows what it actually looks like. So you can see the actual plasma membranous cell wall. You also see the chloroplast all around the outer edge of that. So as you know, the chloroplasts are the organelles found in plant cells that do photosynthesis. So I want to point out some very important cells in this cross-section of the leaf. So we have the guard cells right here. And I like to think of guard cells almost being like the mouth of the plant. So as you can see in the cross-section, we have carbon dioxide coming in and oxygen going out. So the guard cells can actually close up, just like a mouth, and stop these gases from entering in and leaving the plant leaf. So these are very important cells for managing gas exchange. Okay, so now let's look at the chloroplast itself. So again, as you know, the chloroplast is the site of photosynthesis in the plant cell. So just like the mitochondria, the chloroplast has an inner and outer membrane. So they have two lipid bilayers. So the sort of the open space is called the stroma. You can think of it almost being like the cytoplasm of the chloroplast. So again, the technical term for that is the stroma of the chloroplast, so just the open space. Then you have these thylakoids right here. So the thylakoid, as we're going to see, is going to be very important for a lot of reactions that take place in photosynthesis. And of course, the empty space in the thylakoid is called the thylakoid space, so that's just the empty space in there. So a lot of these anatomical features we're going to see come up again later in this lecture once we start talking about the actual reactions that take place during photosynthesis. So there's one feature I skipped, and I'm going to have a question for you guys that's related to that. So what do you think the vein of the leaf is bringing to the chloroplasts and leaves? So I didn't mention this vein right here, but as you can see, it extends into the cross-section of the leaf, so it's bringing something towards the leaf. So here's question 4 for Blackboard. So to answer this question, we need to go over the overall reaction of photosynthesis again. So remember, photosynthesis is taking carbon dioxide plus water and makes glucose and oxygen. So as you all probably know, carbon dioxide is a gas and water is usually a liquid. So think about why we feed our plants water. So why you have to water your plant every couple of days or else it's going to dry out. And that's because, as you can see here, water is a crucial component of photosynthesis. So it's one of the true reactants of photosynthesis. And as you probably know, the roots of the plant, which I have in a figure at the bottom of the slide, those bring the water up through the roots, through the stem, and all the way up to the leaves. So this vein right here is actually bringing water towards the leaves. And as you can imagine, it's a two-way system. So the roots are bringing water up towards the leaves, and the leaves, because they're able to do photosynthesis, are bringing sugars back down towards the roots. So it's a two-way highway, so water from the roots up to the leaves, and glucose from the leaves down to the roots. So here's really the meat of the lecture. So these are the two major reactions that take place during photosynthesis. So we have the light reactions and the Kelvin cycle. So both these can go by many names. The light reactions can also be called the light-dependent reactions, so they depend on light. The Kelvin cycle can be called the dark reactions or the light-independent reactions. So the Kelvin cycle is independent of light. So just be aware of that. If you're using a different textbook for this class or for a different class, it may go by different names. So as you can see, For the light reactions, the major input is water, and the major output is oxygen. For the Kelvin cycle, or the dark reactions, the input is carbon dioxide, and the output is sugar. So as you know, water and carbon dioxide are the major reactants of photosynthesis. Oxygen and sugar are the major outputs. So really the major purpose of the light reactions is to produce electron carriers and ATP. As you're going to soon see, the Kelvin cycle, which produces sugars, is very, very energetically costly. So it's very important that we produce electron carriers like this NADPH and ATP because that reaction is going to take a lot of energy. So again, we have an endergonic reaction and a very costly one at that. So as alluded to, the light reactions require light. So you can see light coming in. We're going to see how light plays a role in all this a little bit later on. And again, the light reactions are all about forming ATP and the electron carrier NADPH. And as you can see, we have ATP hydrolyzed to ADP. So the Kelvin cycle is using up lots of ATP, and it's also oxidizing NADPH to NADP. And this is a cycle, so this keeps going round and around. So as the light reactions produce NADPH and ATP, the Kelvin cycle is using them up to make sugars. So we're first going to focus on the light reactions. And before we can talk about the actual specific reactions that take place, we have to talk a little bit about physics first. So light reactions are crucial for the conversion of light energy to chemical energy. So essentially the light reactions produce all the energy needed to make NADP, the electron carrier, be reduced to NADPH. It also provides the energy to make ATP as well, as we're going to see in a couple of slides later. So the process of actually converting light energy to chemical energy is called transduction. So we're transducing light energy to chemical energy. So essentially we're having an energy conversion here. And as you all probably know, electromagnetic waves, so waves like light, have energy. So a good example of this is microwaves. So as you know, a microwave releases microwaves and that heats up our food. So as you can see, electromagnetic waves have energy. So here we have the electromagnetic wave spectrum. So I'm going to go slowly over this figure right here since it's very complex. So the first thing I want to talk about is the wavelength. So electromagnetic waves are waves, so they look something like this. So they have peaks and crevices, and the distance between those peaks, so the distance between here and here, can vary. So if the distance between those peaks is short, that's a shorter wavelength. If it's very long, like this, that's a longer wavelength. So looking at this gray part right here, something like a gamma ray that has a short wavelength, something like a radio wave has a long wavelength. So again, the distance between the peaks of radio waves is very long. In general, shorter wavelengths have higher energy. So something like a gamma ray or X-ray has a lot of energy compared to something like a radio wave, which has lower amounts of energy than a gamma ray or X-ray. As you can see, we can actually quantify the distance of the wavelengths, or the distance of the peaks. So here we have 10 to the negative 5 nanometers, and something like a radio wave, which has very, very long wavelengths, that can go up to 10 to the 3 meters. So you can go from very, very small, so very small wavelengths, like in gamma rays, all the way up to very large wavelengths, as in radio waves. So really what we're interested in is called the visible spectrum, or here, visible light. So this region right here, so this is the light we're actually able to see. So as you can see, purple colors are more on the shorter wavelength spectrum, and reds are more on the longer wavelength spectrum. So really, we're going to see how visible light plays a role in photosynthesis in the next few slides. So the reason why I bring this up is because pigments actually transduce or absorb light. So again, pigments transduce electromagnetic waves and convert those into chemical energy. So you've probably heard of a pigment. Definitely, if you've gone through high school biology and maybe even middle school biology, you've definitely heard of some pigments before. So think back to those classes and try to remember one of the pigments you've studied. So the pigment molecule you probably came up with was chlorophyll. So that gives plants their green color. So we'll learn a little bit more about why chlorophyll is actually green in lab, but for now I'll show you the next slide to give you an idea of how chlorophyll works. So here we have some chlorophyll, which is the green color again, and we have some light hitting it. So again, some electromagnetic waves are hitting that chlorophyll molecule. So chlorophyll actually has an interesting structure since it allows its electrons to actually go to a higher energy state. So here that wavelength, or that photon of light, is hitting the chlorophyll and is allowing the chlorophyll molecules to get more energy and become excited. So now we have excited electrons. So you can think of them being a higher energy level, and as they decrease in energy level, they release heat and they release fluorescence. So essentially, as this electron goes back down to its ground state, or to the original energy level it was first at, it's releasing energy. So this is how chlorophyll transduces light energy into chemical energy. And as we're going to see, that's going to play a major role in photosynthesis. Okay, so here's actually how a pigment molecule comes into play during photosynthesis. So here we have a photosystem. So you can imagine this being the major enzyme that does photosynthesis, more specifically the light reactions of photosynthesis. It's embedded in the thylakoid membrane. So if you remember back to the plant anatomy we did, the thylakoid membrane is that sort of pancake-like structure that's found in the chloroplast. So again, it's embedded in a lipid bilayer. So here you have phospholipids, as you can see. So you have that photosystem embedded in that lipid bilayer. Each of these green circles, just like in the last picture, is a molecule of chlorophyll. So essentially what happens is we have some light shine on this photosystem. That photon comes in and starts exciting all of these chlorophyll molecules. You then have energy jumping around, and eventually it reaches these pair of chlorophyll molecules in the center. Same exact idea as in the last picture. This electron becomes excited, but what's different here is instead of falling back down to its ground state, as we saw in the last figure, here this photosystem actually steals that electron. So we have what's called the primary electron acceptor. So essentially it steals that electron from these pair of chlorophyll molecules. So again, instead of that electron going down to its ground state and releasing heat and fluorescence, here we have the photosystem actually stealing that electron. And we're going to see what happens to the electron in the next figure. So here we have a more zoomed out figure showing actually the light reactions in its entirety. So to sort of orient you, again, we're looking at the thylakoid membrane. We have the stroma on the outside, and inside we have a thylakoid space. So sort of what we talked about was photosystem 2. So the last figure I showed you was photosystem 2, and now we're also going to talk about photosystem 1. So as you can see, the photosystems are actually flipped. So photosystem 2 actually starts the reactions, and photosystem 1 ends it. So just be aware of that. They're flipped here, so photosystem 2 actually comes first. So they're actually named based on which was discovered first. In this case, photosystem 1 was discovered first, even though it's second in the reaction. So the first thing that happens, again, is we have light come along. It excites the chlorophyll molecules, and these pair of chlorophyll molecules give away one of its electrons. So this is an issue here. So that chlorophyll or pair of chlorophyll molecules don't like losing an electron. So now they've lost an electron, they want one back. So the way they actually get it back is by breaking apart water. So as you can see, water splits apart, gives away some electrons, and we have oxygen and protons produced. So this is, again, one of the major reactants and products of the light reactions here. So remember, the overall equation for photosynthesis is water plus carbon dioxide equals glucose plus oxygen. So as you can see, we have water coming in, we have oxygen being produced. So really, again, the point of water giving away its electrons is to make the chlorophyll molecules happy again. So those water molecules give away those electrons and become split into oxygen and protons. So now that photosystem 2 has stolen those electrons, and those electrons are now going to go through an electron transport chain. So exact same idea as oxidative phosphorylation. Here the electron transport chain is all about producing a proton gradient. And we're going to see in a little bit why this proton gradient is important for photosynthesis. So these yellow arrows just show the path. So electrons. And you can see that protons are being pumped across the membrane. So eventually these electrons hit photosystem 1. And they give their electrons to these pair of chlorophyll molecules right here. So just like photosystem 2, photosystem 1 also requires light. So be aware of that. Light's required for both photosystem 2 and photosystem 1. It's not just one of them, it's both. So light comes along, it makes all these chlorophyll molecules very excited, and it excites some of the electrons from the pair of chlorophyll molecules in the center. So because those chlorophyll molecules got electrons earlier from photosystem 2, and ultimately from those first pair of chlorophyll molecules, water doesn't have to come along for photosystem 1 to work. So photosystem 1 is totally fine giving away these electrons without having to split water. So really the whole entire point of this process is to bring electrons towards NADP, where it can get churned into NADPH. So this is the reduced form of NAD+, NADPH. And as you can see, NADPH is going to be used for the Kelvin cycle later on. So we'll see its role in a few slides from now. So to sort of review all of that, here's a question for Blackboard. So when a photon of the correct energy is absorbed by a photosystem, an electron is energized and transferred to a primary electron acceptor. This creates an electron hole. How is the missing electron replaced? So we went over this a little bit already, but remember that water fills this electron hole. So water gets split, and actually the electrons from the hydrogen are donated toward this hole to fill it. So here the correct answer is B. So electrons from hydrogen made available by splitting water replace the missing electrons. So it's very important that you remember that. So that happens for photosystem 2 of the light reactions. So as we saw, there's an electron transport chain portion of the light reactions. And so we have pumping of protons or hydrogen ions into the thylakoid space. And so you may be asking, why does the cell do this? So what's the point of all this? And so just like oxidative phosphorylation, actually, this proton gradient or hydrogen ion gradient is used for ATP synthase. So there's actually an ATP synthase right here embedded in the thylakoid membrane. So actually, the chloroplast itself is capable of generating ATP. So same exact process as in oxidative phosphorylation, but here this ATP is being specifically used for the Kelvin cycle or the dark reactions. So that's the reason why we have ATP synthase here, is because we need ATP for the Kelvin cycle. So it would make sense that since we already have electron transport chain, we might as well generate some ATP while we're here. That way we don't have to transport it in or anything like that. It's already here for us to use for the Kelvin cycles. So that, along with NADPH, is going to be shoveled to the Kelvin cycles, or the dark reactions. And that is the next topic we're going to talk about. So the Kelvin cycle takes in carbon dioxide, as we already talked about, and produces sugars. So essentially this is the meat, or the most important part of photosynthesis. Here we're actually producing the sugar the plant is going to be using as a food source. So here's the Kelvin cycle, or dark reactions. So as you can see, it's very similar to the citric acid cycle. So it's a cyclical reaction, so it goes round and round. So the first major input is carbon dioxide in the form of a gas. The most important enzyme really in photosynthesis is not photosystem 1 or 2, or any of the other enzymes we talked about. It's really this enzyme right here, Rubisco. So it's a very important enzyme to remember. And the reasons why it's so important is because it's able to fix carbon dioxide. So it's able to actually take carbon dioxide out of the air, or out of the stroma where it's floating around, and actually fix it. And as you can see, step 1, carbon fixation, is the first step of the Kelvin cycle, or dark reactions. So Rubisco, along with carbon dioxide, is able to form this molecule right here, 3-PGA. We have a bunch of ATP, here's 6, and a bunch of NADPH go into this reaction, and we have 6 G3P. So these G3P molecules should be somewhat familiar to you. This is one of the metabolic intermediates of glycolysis that we talked about in chapter 6. One of those G3P molecules can be used to make sugars. So through some more steps, we actually have glucose formed. The rest of those G3P molecules, though, get sent back through the Kelvin cycle. We have more ATP invested, 3 more, and we're back to our starting molecule right here. So again, I want you to know the major inputs and outputs of the Kelvin cycle. And of course, again, Rubisco is a very important enzyme, so I want you to remember that. Again, it's important because it's able to actually fix carbon dioxide. So while photosystem 1, photosystem 2, ATP synthase are very important molecules, here I want you to remember Rubisco is a very, very important enzyme, and probably the most important enzyme for photosynthesis. So I'll end this lecture by going over the slide right here. So I think this is a good summary of the light and dark reactions and all the content we've covered in this lecture. So first we started off by talking about the light reactions. We saw how light comes in and excites chlorophyll. Because chlorophyll gives away its electrons, water needs to be split. So water is one of the major inputs. It gets split, hydrogen gives away its electrons, and essentially we're left with some oxygen at the very end of this process. In addition to producing oxygen, we also have ATP made. Just remember there is that ATP synthase in the thylakoid membrane making ATP. And we have NADPH. So those electrons that the chlorophyll gave away get donated to NAD+, and that gets turned into NADPH. Those NADPH then get used in the Kelvin cycle. So in the Kelvin cycle, we have carbon dioxide come in. That gets fixed by the enzyme Rubisco. We have a bunch of ATP and NADPH invested into this process, and eventually we get a little bit of sugar produced at the very end of it. Just like the citric acid cycle, the Kelvin cycle is a cyclical process, so we end up with the same starting products at the very end.